So this is Alice after she's picked up the bottle that says "Drink Me" and has grown. Not really sure why her neck has grown so long, but the caption says, "Why? It must be somatotropin, the growth hormone." So, not that many endocrine jokes in the world. So we're going to move. We did the head, we did the pituitary, we did the pineal gland. We're going to come down. Remember, salivary glands are exocrine glands, so they don't count. They'll show up in the digestive system. And right here, on kind of the lower part of your voice box, you can kind of sort of feel it, is your thyroid. There's thyroid kind of like wing-shaped on both sides of your voice box. And your thyroid controls your overall metabolic rate. Part of what your metabolic rate does is it helps generate the heat that keeps us at a steady temperature. So it's associated with both metabolism and so energy use and temperature generation. So people that have overactive thyroids tend to be thin. They burn off a lot of calories really easily. They run a little hot. People whose thyroid glands don't work as well, which happens to some people as they get older, they feel cold all the time, and their energy levels are very low. And their eyes get bulgy. I don't know what the connection is there. But your thyroid hormone is almost the only thing in your body that integrates iodine into it. Thyroid hormone has iodine in it. So obviously that means we need iodine, but we don't need much because we do recycle it pretty well. And we don't, crank huge amounts of these hormones out. But it does give people who treat cancers an opportunity to target the cancer in a weird way. They can have you drink a cocktail with radioactive iodine in it. And it's dilute, so it doesn't really generate enough radiation to bother you as it goes through your digestive system or through your circulation system. But your thyroid will pull the iodine in to save it, to use it, and so it will pull the radioactive iodine into your thyroid gland, and so you can deliver radioactivity, radiation, to a thyroid tumor if you have a cancer in your thyroid. Sometimes for goiters too. Goiters are just overactive thyroids, not necessarily cancerous. But there's very few radioactive materials you can give somebody that you can trust to just settle in one place that you need to target with the radiation. But it is done with radioactive iodine. Embedded in the thyroid are 4 little glands called the parathyroids. And the parathyroids, if you have some reason where your thyroid needs to be removed, they're taking that with it because there's really no way to take the thyroid and leave the parathyroids behind. And it's not that easy to even differentiate these when you're looking at thyroids to be sure you're looking at the parathyroids. But these are a very different gland. They do a very different thing. They do work with the thyroid because the thyroid is somewhat involved in this, but they are involved in calcium control. Calcium is an important ion, not just in your bones, but it also is very important for nerve and muscle function. And it interacts with vitamin D, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Vitamin D is very much involved in calcium control as well, and parathormone. That's a not very imaginative name for the hormone. Parathormone is very much involved in calcium control. There's some adrenal input to calcium control as well. Kind of gives you an idea how important it is. Now we get to one that isn't always considered part of the endocrine system. It's right here underneath your sternum, and it is part of your immune system. It releases a lot of immune molecules into your blood. Immunoglobulins that we talked about globulins before. None of them are generally considered to be hormones. So some books don't consider this part of the endocrine system if they go, okay, if it doesn't make hormones, we're not considering it. But some books, because it does produce secretions that leave in the blood, consider it to be an endocrine gland, which it is, and then consider it to be part of the endocrine system. So it does, vary from book to book whether your thymus is considered part of it. It does shrink as you get older, and that does have an effect on your overall ability, your overall immune system function. There's a lot of communication that goes on in your digestive system. To some extent, your stomach can analyze the food that it's dealing with. Where omnivores, we eat a bunch of different things, but different things require different digestive enzymes or input from bile if it's a lipidy material. And so your stomach and your intestines are kind of communicating back and forth with one another. We got this coming, you got to send these these enzymes. We got this coming, we need bile from the gallbladder. And so there's a lot of connection back and forth that's chemical. Also, your stomach, when it starts to get empty, it sends a message to your brain saying we're getting empty, we maybe need to eat something. And when it starts to get full, it sends a message saying maybe you should stop eating. Not the most powerful signals in the world, but there are hormonal exchanges that go on among and beyond your digestive system. Suspended in the membrane that holds your intestine together is your pancreas. Now, your pancreas is an exocrine gland in that it produces a bunch of digestive enzymes that can digest all the different things that we've got in our food. We can pull those molecules apart. It also produces bicarbonate because the intestines don't work really well in an acidic environment, but there's acid coming out of the stomach. So you need to neutralize the acid with bicarbonate. That comes from the pancreas. But that's all exocrine. It goes down through tubes into the digestive system. The endocrine aspect of your pancreas is insulin. It detects sugar, glucose, not any kind of sugar, but glucose specifically, coming in the blood from your digestive system, and it sends insulin out as a message to, okay, let's get some of this stored away for later. We don't want to flood the system with sugar. It's too energetic. People go, your system will go a little nuts. So, but we're going to need the energy later. And I've mentioned this before. The target cells for insulin are mostly in your liver. Your liver stores the sugar as starch, and then we'll let it out later. And also your muscle cells will store stuff in response to insulin, and your fat cells will not store sugar, but they'll use the energy to produce fat, which is a long-term energy storage because it's kind of just sits there as blobs. So we have insulin. If there's a message that tells your liver and other cells to store the sugar, then there must be a message to get the sugar back out. And that's what glucagon is. Glucagon, mostly the target cells are in the liver, and it says, that sugar that you stored away as starch, well, we haven't had anything sugary for a while, give us the sugar back. And, but the insulin control has to be, you gotta really jump on the sugars when it gets out there, so you have way more cells making insulin than you do making glucagon. Glucagon is kind of a nudge. Give us a little bit, give us a little bit, give us a little bit. So you don't need lots of cells making that. And they are different cells making. Your insulin cells don't make glucagon and vice versa. That turns out to be important. Diabetes. There is supposedly two different types of diabetes. I'll get to that in a second. There's type 1, Used to be called juvenile diabetes because it tends to show up during a lifetime. It tends to show up early in life. And it is called insulin-dependent diabetes because it's an autoimmune condition. I mentioned this before. You're in response to something. We're not entirely sure what. Your immune system produces antibodies, and in some people, the antibodies are not that specific, and they will attach to cells that make insulin. And of course, once they're attached there, your immune system goes, oh, you want us to kill those? Okay. Comes in and kills your insulin-making cells. You don't make any insulin. If you don't make any insulin, you can't control sugar, you're gonna die. So it's used to be pretty much a death sentence until they came up with ways to extract insulin from other animals and give it to people once they figured out how it all worked. That's type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is actually probably as many as 14 different conditions. And there's been some talk of taking type 2 and breaking it down into different conditions with different names, but so far they haven't really done that very well. Type 2 diabetes they used to call it adult onset diabetes because it tends to occur when you're older. And it is a problem with this system, but there's a whole bunch of different ways this system can go wrong for you. In some people with type 2 diabetes, their insulin production machinery breaks down. They're not making as much insulin as they need to make in order for it to work properly, in which case they may need insulin. In some cases, their cells that are responding to insulin don't respond as well as they used to, and that needs a different kind of medication nudge. In some cases, the insulin is produced, but it is broken down too quickly to do what it's supposed to do. That needs a different type of medication nudge. In some cases, the cells that are supposed to store the insulin, they pick the message up, but they don't do what they're supposed to do properly, and that needs a different type of nudge. So typically, if you have type 2 diabetes, they don't quickly run a lot of tests to figure out which one you've got a problem with. They tend to give you the most common medication for the most common need, and if that doesn't work, then they try you on other stuff. And then they've got ones that clear sugar out through your kidneys faster and do all sorts of various things. But I remember reading a big whole issue of Science magazine on diabetes, and one article about the genetics of type 2 diabetes. And buried way down in the article was some guy going, well, of course we can't find a gene, an allele associated with type 2 diabetes because it's not one thing. It's a whole bunch of different things. So if there is a genetic component, it's going to be different genes in different people causing these different kinds of problems. Last year, I think it was. There's a type of digestive virus that affects kids. Remember, there's not a lot of viruses that affect digestive systems, but there is one that affects kids. And it can be, in rare cases, it can produce really serious effects. And so they developed a vaccine for it, rotavirus vaccine. And they started giving it to kids. And last year, there was an article saying, we're doing some follow-ups on this, we're tracking this, we don't have the data yet, but it's starting to look like the population of kids that are getting vaccines for rotavirus, that the incidence of type 1 diabetes is dropping through the floor in these kids. Because the question always was, what did your immune system originally make antibodies to that eventually winds up attaching to your insulin-making cells? And they're thinking now that it is a rotavirus infection, which is a very common infection. It doesn't produce symptoms in a lot of kids, but it's a very common infection. And something about the virus itself, when you get infected with a virus or a pathogen, you don't just make one antibody to one molecule. You make a bunch of antibodies to a bunch of molecules on the thing. A vaccine tends to be, depending on how they made the vaccine, often it's just one target molecule. So by marshaling your immune system against the rotaviruses, you don't ever get infected with the real rotaviruses. You don't make the antibodies to the other molecules that then attach to the insulin cells. And then maybe you don't kill the insulin cells. It's still a work in progress. Maybe it'll pan out, maybe it won't, but that's what they think is going on with type 1 diabetes and how it works. When you are checked for diabetes, they do what's called an A1C. They can check your sugar levels on any given day, but your sugar levels can fluctuate quite a bit. Your glucose levels, I say glucose as if it means sugar. Glucose is just one type of sugar. But your hemoglobin that carries the oxygen in your red blood cells is sticky for glucose. On those rare occasions that glucose, the ring opens up. It's sticky for hemoglobin, it sticks on there. But your red blood cells don't last very long. So the red blood cells you have in circulation are at most, 3-4 months old. And so if you can read the amount of glucose that's in your hemoglobin, you get a blood sample, you pop open the blood cells, you check the hemoglobin for glucose. You can read from that the average circulating glucose levels for a couple of months, which is much better than just checking it one time on one day. And that's why they use A1Cs as a test for diabetes, because it's more of a long-term perspective on the glucose in your blood. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll pick up the adrenal glands on the last one.